I always feel like there's something special about the second entry in a franchise. If you like the first game, it's confirmation that that wasn't just a one-off adventure. That doesn't necessarily say anything of the quality of that second entry, but the feeling of being able to return to the characters or even just ideas that you grew attached to is invigorating. For better or worse, it's not just a blank slate. You have expectations and assumptions, but at the start of that second entry, franchise convention hasn't been established yet. What is and isn't core to a franchise's identity is in many respects still up in the air. Things will likely be familiar, but also different, in large or small ways. If you really loved the first game, it can definitely be worrying, but there's also the potential that you might love the second game even more. This feeling of delving into this unique mixture of the familiar and the unknown never stops being exciting to me, especially when it's a franchise that I didn't really expect to like. On that note, I'm Kalice, and I recommend Professor Layton and the Diabolical Box, or outside of North America, Professor Layton and Pandora's Box, which is a bit of a telling title, but whatever.
Hey, it's you!
Yes, I had the sneaking suspicion that it was you who was tailing us.
Flora, what are you doing here?
I'm sorry. It's just... Well, you see, I just didn't want to be all alone again.
Professor?
What lies ahead could be dangerous.
Huh?
That's why you'll have to be extra careful. All right?
Yep.
After the first Layton game, I was cautiously excited for more. I loved my time with it, the characters were especially amazing, but it had pacing issues and some bad puzzles. Turns out, I really didn't have a reason to be worried. Everything that I loved about the first game was here, and it improved on pretty much everything that I had a problem with. Once again, Layton caught me off guard with how much I enjoyed the game. Before we delve into exactly why, there's a very small amount of housekeeping I want to take care of. The first 3 Layton games won a poll on my Patreon. I talked about this in the first video. This is happening now because of that poll, so thank you to everyone who voted in that. I played the mobile HD version of this game specifically through BlueStacks. The DS version of this one is a solid option, but the mobile version is probably easier to get your hands on and has cute sprites for who you're traveling with in the story, and has easy access to the weekly puzzles, so I recommend that version. Finally, as this game is a sequel, by its nature there are going to be implicit and explicit spoilers for the first game while I talk about the second one. I won't go into detail on the mysteries of the first game. You could still enjoy that aspect of the first game after watching this video, but there are some plot elements that I'll be touching on at least a bit. You can watch my first Layton video, it's linked in the description. Do with that information what you will. Life has been absolutely crazy lately. This is probably not going to come out in time for Halloween, but this is kinda sorta my Halloween video, so happy belated Halloween! This game does get spooky sometimes, especially near the end, so I'm just gonna count it as a Halloween type of video. I'll try to schedule out a proper horror thing for next Halloween, because I do like horror, but just, you know, a million things to talk about. So no promises. Our story starts on a much stronger, intriguing, and gripping note. Our cold open sees our gentlemanly duo of Professor Layton and Luke boarding a train, the Momentary Express. 2 familiar characters are also boarding the train, Flora, attempting to disguise her face, and Shelmy, whose face is hopefully not a disguise. On board the train, Luke and Layton have some cute commentary about how fancy of a train this is, before going on to talk about the mysterious Elysian box. Apparently, this is an item that kills anyone who opens it. This is obviously a completely ludicrous claim that we'd have no reason to believe if not for the fact that Layton and Luke have apparently witnessed this themselves. Then we exit animated cutscene land and jump back a bit in time to Layton and Luke at Layton's office. Herschel Layton, yes, his first name is Herschel, which is both horrible and yet incredibly fitting, has received a letter from Dr. Schrader, his mentor. I do appreciate finding out that Layton was taught by someone and didn't just, like, emerge fully formed from the ether as his gentlemanly self, so he's human. Probably. Turns out that Schrader has acquired a relic known as the Elysian Box and is determined to unravel its many mysteries, even knowing the possibly fatal rumors surrounding it. Layton, understandably, has a bad feeling about this, so he decides to visit his friend in person, and of course Luke wants to tag along. That's kind of his deal. The journey through London to Schrader's office is the framing for the game's tutorial, which, as you can probably guess, goes over the basics of all the game's mechanics. All of these will be familiar to you if you played the first game. The core gameplay loop is pretty much identical. Walk around and talk to a wonderfully varied cast of characters who present puzzles to you, or until you encounter problems that you solve in the form of puzzles, of course. Many of them are optional, some of them are not. This tutorial is where you can also start to see some of the other improvements over the original. For one, the puzzles are integrated in a much smoother way. As elaborate as the puzzles can get, the progression blocking puzzles actually tend to be about figuring out a problem directly presented in the narrative. This was true very early on in Layton 1, but started being arbitrary rather quickly. It was still fun, but I have more fun when I feel like I'm solving some sort of problem in the narrative as well. Plus, it helps me get into the headspace of Layton at least a bit, which adds to the experience. The early game puzzles are simple, of course, but they introduce concepts and the types of thinking that you'll need to succeed in the later, harder puzzles, which is a rather amazing accomplishment considering what a wide variety of puzzles the Layton games asks you to solve. Logical thinking, knowing how to spot important details present in a large amount of information, and knowing how to think in rather weird ways are all taught to you organically through the first few puzzles. The easier puzzles got me into the right headspace for the harder puzzles without outright giving away their solutions, and there actually seemed to be a rather consistent and satisfying difficulty curve. Yes, I did just describe solving puzzles of increasing difficulty as a satisfying experience. The Layton games may have gotten me to like puzzles, at least a bit, I guess. I don't know why the idea of me enjoying puzzles turns me all tsundere, but here we are. Upon arriving at Schrader's office, there's no response to a knock on his door, so our heroes puzzle their way into the room. It would be time for some breaking and entering, but Schrader did give them the key. It's needlessly elaborate, because that's just how life is in this setting, I guess. This is the tutorial puzzle that teaches outside-the-box thinking, by the way. The puzzle-solving duo enter the room to see that the window is open, Schrader is dead on the ground, and the Elysian box is missing. Okay, yeah, you have my attention, game. Stakes effectively fucking established. And this serves to give Layton a personal investment in this particular mystery, which is something that I felt was sorely missing from the first game. Obviously, they call the police. Before the authorities arrive, Layton discovers a train ticket for the Mollentary Express. Mysteriously, the ticket has no destination written on it. Layton pockets the ticket and instructs Luke to not tell the police about it, which is not the most legal of actions. Look, there's a reason that the D&D alignment chart separates lawful and good. Keep fighting the good fight, Layton.
Fun fact, the original DS release actually has a physical copy of the Mollentary Express ticket hidden away in the instruction booklet for you.
Oh, neat. I wonder if that helps with a puzzle later. Wink.
Wonk.
You want that one or one more?
Well, you laughed at it. I don't know if that ruins the take.
No, that adds to it.
Okay.
You know I'm so tempted to just leave the entirety of this conversation in now, right? Did I? Maybe.
Who knows?
You do.
We don't. Shit.
A familiar face arrives at the scene, Inspector Chelmy, also his assistant Barton, who is a new character. You may recall that we didn't actually meet Inspector Chelmy in the first adventure. Luke definitely recalls this particular piece of information and performs a delicate and measured investigative technique.
No, Luke, let him go. Luke, stop that. That's his face. Listen here, Luke.
Yeah, he goes completely fucking feral on his face, which catches both Chelmy and Layton entirely off guard. Layton manages to calm Luke down and have him apologize, and hey, we as the audience now definitively know that Chelmy is actually Chelmy instead of a particular mustache-twirling baddie. Unless, between now and the train, another disguise was donned by the one and only Don Paolo. Nah, that couldn't have happened. Probably. Anyways, this scene both establishes that the events of the first game will be referenced, which I appreciate, and that weird, crazy, fantastical elements will not be shied away from going forward, which I also appreciate quite a lot. Thinking on it now, this scene actually solidified Luke as my favorite character. I absolutely adore that this little gentleman detective in training has it in him to attack a man he thinks is suspicious. Actually, he might be traumatized. After some further investigating, Layton, Luke, and the law discover further evidence of foul play and find scraps of a torn-up picture that Chelmy confiscates as evidence. This team-up doesn't last particularly long as Chelmy's patience runs thin, and Layton and Luke are politely asked to leave the crime scene. Their only remaining lead on the death of Professor Schrader and the whereabouts of the Elysian box is the ticket for the Momentary Express, so they obviously decide to follow up on that lead. Flash forward a bit and we're caught up to our cold open and are now aboard the Momentary Express. This is a much stronger opening than the Curious Village had. It interested me in the core mystery, made me care more about both Layton and Luke, and established danger and a personal stake in the plot for our heroes. It's just really good, and it never stops being really good. The plot is much better paced, with mysteries being solved, and questions actually being answered throughout the whole game. Almost all of these smaller mysteries provide a piece of the larger overarching mystery of the Elysian box. Everything winds up coming together in a very satisfying way, which I obviously can't get into specifics on. I don't want to spoil those wonderful plot points, but suffice it to say, I always felt like I was engaged with some aspect of the main story and constantly felt a pull to continue playing and find out more. As a side note, there's not any spoilers on the updated descriptions of mysteries once they're solved, like there was on the first game, so feel free to read each and every one as you solve the various mysteries. The crazier parts of the Layton world don't wait nearly as long to surface. I already mentioned that Luke tried to pull off a man's face in the tutorial, but aside from that, the game's entire plot revolves around a seemingly magical murder box, and relatively early on, people start outright stating that vampires might just be like a thing in this setting. After what's in the first game, yeah, sure, vampires can exist, fuck it, why not? Because these fantastical elements get introduced much earlier this time, it makes a lot more sense when those types of things come to the forefront of the plot. Figuring out the what and why of a magical murder box is the crux of the plot, and just like in the first game, solving this mystery is going to wind up going to some weird and probably unexpected places. Also, once again, I did figure out a fairly large piece of the mystery relatively early on, but this time I also definitely made some wildly inaccurate predictions as well. Another thing that I can't really get into at all on account of the spoilers. At any rate, once again I found that as evidence that even though there's some wild stuff involved here, I think it made at least some degree of sense, and I found the process of unraveling the grand mystery to be a satisfying one, so take that for what you will. My favorite parts of the first game are definitely still present. The plot winds up going to an emotional, heartfelt place that ties everything together in a clever and satisfying way. Along with the better pacing, this makes for an absolutely incredible and emotionally moving narrative experience. I cared a lot and cried a lot and really loved it. It's still absolutely brimming with interesting ideas, though this time those ideas are consistently well executed on. So, the Momentary Express is a train, and to start at least is the setting of this adventure. Little known fact about trains, they move. Fittingly enough, there are multiple stops along this journey, which means more dynamic locations to explore, and through the story, all the various locations you visit wind up being tied together in a meaningful way, because writing. As much as I liked St. Mystere, Curious Village did have quite a bit of backtracking. By the time repetition seemed like it was going to set in for a location in Diabolical Box, the plot was already getting ready to move on to somewhere else, but I still got that wholesome feeling of comfort from the locations I was exploring. Except for the places that were meant to be dangerous, obviously. Also, near the end of the adventure, there are actually some rather spooky locales as well. I don't think it ever crosses the line into full-on horror, but I always appreciate horror influences. So yay for me! All of the characters that you'll meet on the Momentary Express and its various stops are weird and fun and crazy and delightful. Their designs are wonderfully varied, all clearly human, but not at all concerned with sticking to real-world proportions, and pretty much every line of dialogue is charming and clever. Also, as a side note, the first game had an elaborate and perfectly sound justification for all of the characters being completely obsessed with puzzles. This game doesn't have that. The world of Layton is just incredibly obsessed with puzzles. And you know what? I'm fine with that. It's just like everyone in Yu-Gi-Oh! World being obsessed with a card game. It's just how things are. I can definitely suspend my disbelief for that. I've definitely done it for more crazy things. Just walking around and talking to NPCs was just as much of a motivation for me to continue as the main narrative. The story kept me constantly wanting to come back for more, while talking to NPCs and exploring kept me moving forward moment to moment. It's a combination that makes the whole experience, both on a macro and micro scale, a satisfying and memorable one. The characters, locations, and plot all feed into and build off of each other. The first Layton game did something similar, and of course, it's hard to get too specific without getting into spoilers, but basically, almost everything that you are doing, as unimportant as it may seem, is likely in some way related to the grander mystery and plot. A lot of games provide a very broad but not particularly deep experience. Open world games, for example, often feel very shallow to me. They provide a lot of places to walk around to and a checklist of things to do. Those things could very well be enjoyable on their own, but often what I'm doing feels somewhat arbitrary and unconnected from the rest of the experience. Even with how weird and out there a lot of the stuff in Layton is, everything in it manages to feel perfectly natural to Layton's unique flavor of adventure and exploration. On specific characters, Ilyana's my favorite side character. The simple reason is that I'm gay and she's pretty. The more complicated reason is potentially a can of worms, but hey, if I'm gonna talk about Bayonetta one day, I'm gonna have to broach this topic eventually. In recent memory, I found myself very much liking women in fiction who own or even flaunt their sexuality in a way that comes off as empowering as opposed to reductive, degrading, or otherwise gross. It's very much a case-by-case basis, but as a general rule of thumb, if something like this seems like it's purposefully meant to entice the audience and serves literally no other purpose, I'll probably hate it, but otherwise I'll probably enjoy it. Unfortunately, the vast majority of instances of characters like this are shallow, misogynistic, and otherwise rife with problematic content. Ilyana works at, or according to the UK version, owns a cabaret. Layton is generally a wholesome series. The whole experience is pretty much PG, and Ilyana isn't an exception to this, which winds up meaning that her character has all of the pieces of archetypes like this that I like, without even starting to broach into the stuff that I find repulsive. The cynic in me wants to say that the rating of Layton is the only reason that I found Ilyana's portrayal so favorable, but regardless of the reason, I love her. Once again, Layton and Luke don't really develop much as characters over the course of the plot, which is fine, but this time they do have more personal investment and personality. Layton's mentor is dead, so he's even more invested than usual in solving this mystery. I think this strikes a good balance. It does still feel like Layton and Luke are outsiders in this plotline, as if it were just one episode of their ongoing adventures, but giving them some sort of personal reason to be there invested me in the narrative much more quickly, since I already cared about Layton and Luke. They won me over on their previous adventure. Layton is still the perfect gentleman, kind, composed, emotionally sensitive, and clever. Luke tries his best to emulate, but he is still a child, which winds up meaning that he's sometimes unintentionally mean or impulsive. But he's trying his best. They're good boys, and I love them, even more so now that I know that Luke is absolutely ready to attack at a moment's notice. Also, Layton's journal entries that can update you on the plot if you step away from the game for a while have even more personality this time around, which is delightful. So, we've already established that this is a setting where weird, fantastical stuff can happen, right? You may recall that Luke had an affinity for animals in the first game, which is actually something that he's more competent with than Layton, which I appreciate. That affinity has expanded a bit this time. I don't know how to get to this other than to just say it. Luke can talk to animals, and it's not rationalized or explained away. He can just have full-on complex conversations with cows and dogs and presumably every other member of the animal kingdom. It's super weird, but I kind of love it. Like, I feel as if Layton as a series could pretty much throw anything at me at this point, and I'd simultaneously just think that it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, while also being completely and utterly willing to just accept that as the truth of this world. Can other people talk to animals in this setting? I have no fucking idea, but Luke definitely can. Lily, do they ever actually explain how or why he can do that?
No.
Oh, okay. Great. I was delighted to see that Flora returns and gets to have a role in this game. It's another touch that references back to the events of Curious Village. I like feeling rewarded for playing through the previous entries in a franchise, and getting to see Flora's new life definitely felt rewarding in that respect. I love Flora just as much as I love Layton and Luke. I won't go into the details of how, but she does eventually join up with Layton and Luke and travel around with them for a while, but she ultimately has a rather minor role in the game. She doesn't have nearly as much dialogue as our protagonists, even when she's traveling with them. Like, there are many instances of her just standing there completely silent while an entire conversation is happening around her. It's just a bit weird. She does eventually get almost entirely sidelined. She's only actively with the lads for maybe a third of the game. I at the very least wish that she had puzzle submission animations like Layton and Luke have for the bits of the game that she's actually present for, so it feels like she was a part of the actual gameplay puzzle solving stuff. So yeah, on Flora, overall, I'm very glad that she's here, but I wish she played a larger role. It's what she deserves, damn it. Also, now that I can actually talk about Flora without setting off the equivalent of a spoiler nuke, I want to discuss a potentially icky aspect of the writing around her. In one of her Japanese profile descriptions, she's described as, quote, self-proclaimed Layton's bride candidate. Hey, what the fuck? Alright, let's unpack this. Exact ages for some characters aren't given, but according to fan deductions and best guesses, Flora is slightly older than Luke, who is probably 12 or 13, so let's just say that she's 15 or 16. Layton is apparently 37 in the third game, and that takes place pretty close in time to the first two games, so it's safe to assume he'd only be a year younger than that at most. Alright, so Bullet 1, Flora's underage. Bullet 2, there's an age gap of like 20 years. And Bullet fucking 3, Layton is her guardian. This is creepy and gross and uncomfortable on so many levels. The power imbalance is massive, and if Layton returns her feelings in the slightest, then that violates everything that I love about him as a character. The Layton games are like a safe, welcoming, comfy place to me, and this completely goes against that. It just feels so completely out of place that I find it difficult to process. That said, there are a couple of things, or I guess a line of thinking that doesn't really make me okay with it, but does let me push this to the side and continue to enjoy this game and the series as a whole. Do not underestimate my powers of compartmentalization. There's the fairly real possibility that this is just a one-sided crush, which is still kind of uncomfortable and certainly unnecessary, but doesn't ruin the rest of the experience for me. When I was a child, I definitely had a bunch of crushes on adults. Like, it's a thing that happens. As long as the adults don't encourage or return those feelings, then it's fine. This is how I choose to interpret what's presented here. As far as I know, it's never really directly addressed in the text outside of that profile description, and literally never addressed in the English version. I won't go into details, but there is eventually a rather massive time skip, and to my knowledge, there's no evidence that in that time their relationship ever broached from the familial into the romantic, so this line of thinking does slot into the course of events fairly well. That said, my literal decades of exposure to Japanese games and anime has repeatedly and emphatically taught me that if something seems like it could go in a creepy direction, 9 times out of 10 it will. I semi-recently found myself getting invested in If It's For My Daughter, I'd Even Defeat a Demon Lord, before I did all the research I should have because it looked cute, so I just started watching it. This was a fucking mistake. Fuck that series, and fuck that author. I hate that I have to be on guard for creepy stuff like this, because if it does wind up going in a creepy direction, it'll either greatly lessen my enjoyment of something, or outright completely ruin it. All signs point to this being a one-sided childhood crush, and given the direction the franchise has gone, it will probably never be addressed again, so I can cautiously look past this potential red flag. Of course, if you can't, then I completely understand, and I'm sorry for not mentioning this in my first video. On a much lighter note, criminal activity, or more specifically, let's talk antagonists. Don Paulo, in all of his Saturday morning cartoon glory, was an amazing villain in the first game. I fucking love him and can't get enough of him. Much like Layton and Luke, he was an outsider to the plot. He was the only other entity tied specifically to Layton, and much like Layton and Luke, he didn't have a personal investment in the narrative. For Layton and Luke, this really wasn't that big of a deal because they were there the whole time, whereas Don Paulo, as much as I love him, did feel somewhat out of place. This is definitely not a problem for the villain of Diabolical Box. I can't talk about them in any detail, of course, but they're deeply entrenched in the narrative and mystery that we spend the whole game building towards, which feels far more satisfying and fitting. They're legitimately one of my favorite parts of the game, and they exemplify everything that I love about this wacky, clever, heartfelt series. Chelmy and Barton also play a role. It's nice that there's another group working specifically on solving some aspect of the mystery that Layton and Luke are working towards solving. They're another element that can provide intrigue and challenge while not necessarily being wholly antagonistic. They can get in the way, sure, but they can also help when problems arise. Chelmy is a much more straightforward thinker, which helps illustrate how off the wall and genius that Layton is. Also, Barton is there, and he is very determined. I'm sure you've noticed that there are once again animated sequences. They're still clearly not meant for particularly high resolution screens. Unfortunate but understandable. PA Works once again delivers high quality work that I can't show off the highest points of without giving away some of the spoilers that I've worked so hard to dance around, so yeah, not gonna do that. Apologies. Production quality in general has gone up in the non-fully animated sequences as well. Individual character animations are more complex and interesting. Voice acting is far more common, and conversations in the main narrative have unique art more often that is implemented in a way that makes the events come off as more tense and dynamic. Obviously, this is a change for the better. The music is once again excellent and has the same unique sound that the first game had. Classical instruments played in a variety of styles that I don't have the musical knowledge to properly classify, but it continues to suit everything that you're doing absolutely perfectly and is consistently high quality and emotionally moving. I do listen to the first Layton soundtrack fairly regularly, and I fully intend to add the second game's music into that mix as well. I actually really found myself enjoying the remix of the puzzle theme for this one, which is good because, as you might imagine, that track plays very often. There's also a vocal track during the credits of the Japanese version, so maybe look that up once you finish the game if you're curious. I did. It is pleasant, but pretty much what you'd expect from a Japanese credits track, so So even further into the video this time, it's time to actually talk about the puzzles and the rest of the gameplay. Broadly speaking, the type of content that you'll be playing is pretty much the same. There are no major unexpected changes, just refinements and tweaks and some replacement side activities, since all of those had to do at least slightly with the context of the story, even if that context was somewhat loose at times, like for the furniture arranging bit. The mechanics for the puzzles are identical. When a puzzle begins, you're given its title, then proceeding through that screen, you're brought to a separate screen. The top of this screen will have the description of the puzzle, the bottom will be where you solve the puzzle by inputting an answer of some kind. Circling something, drawing lines, picking from a list of options, just typing an answer, usually with some sort of limitation, like a number of letters, or just the fact that it's numbers, moving things around in certain ways, and I'm sure some other specific type of solving method that I can't remember at the moment. You're given a number of tools to help solve them that I absolutely did not take full advantage of, like the ability to draw shapes, a color fill tool, and the awesome power of writing things down. And that's pretty much the only one I used. This can all be done on a memo that drops down over the puzzle screen, allowing you to see all of the information, write things down on the puzzle itself, and ensuring that you don't need a piece of scratch paper or something like that. The only other piece of media or tool that you might actually need to complete the puzzles is a calculator, and even in that respect, the game doesn't usually ask you to do anything more than pretty basic math. Of course, the screen of judgment returns after you submit a puzzle answer. Layton or Luke will play a correct or incorrect animation.
Here goes. Piece of cake.
A small part of me found this to be incredibly stressful every single time it happened, even though I was save scumming, so any possible negative consequences of submitting an incorrect answer would have absolutely no chance of having any lasting effects. I probably have anxiety issues. Hey, between that and the insomnia, I'm almost a triple threat of horribly debilitating mental health issues. Actually, I have depression too, so I'm already there. Hooray. At any rate, Picker Rats return and are once again the reason for my save scumming shenanigans. In case you've somehow forgotten or skipped my first video, they're a point system. Each puzzle is worth a set amount of these Picker Rats. On puzzles where you submit answers, submitting an incorrect answer deducts from the Picker Rats you'll earn from correctly solving the puzzle. These are used to unlock a number of cute little bonuses like character profiles and concept art. Because of how the game is set up, if you complete every puzzle, you will absolutely get enough Picker Rats for every unlock, even if you make a ton of mistakes. I wanted the maximum amount of possible Picker Rats because number go up is like a dopamine injection, so I saved before and after every single puzzle. Not the game's fault that I did this, but that doesn't change the fact that the process was incredibly repetitive, and I probably would have enjoyed my time with the game at least a bit more if they weren't a thing. As for the actual puzzles themselves, they're absolutely wonderful this time around. There are a few that are similar to the first game conceptually, but specifically speaking, all of the puzzles are different both from each other and from those in the previous game. There's a very wide variety. If you like puzzle solving of any variety, you're almost certainly going to find something in here that tickles your fancy. Math, logical thinking, parsing specific information from a list of information that is meant to overwhelm and confuse you into entering galaxy brain mode only for the answer to basically be staring you in the face. Just like the rest of the game, it's everything that worked about the first game, but better. I've touched a bit before on the improved difficulty curve, but that really did do a lot for my enjoyment of the moment-to-moment experience. I never felt blindsided by puzzles. Pretty much any complex concept that the game asked me to interact with was in some way subtly foreshadowed by an earlier puzzle. Simple one tells the truth, the other always lies puzzles are placed earlier in the game than more complex puzzles of that style, with more entities involved or more details to figure out. Part of this may be my experience with the first game, but I always felt like I was in the right headspace to solve a puzzle throughout Diabolical Box. Whereas in the Curious Village, I regularly found myself having to struggle through a metaphorical mental mile before I could properly start to actually solve a puzzle. Even when I encountered a puzzle I found difficult, confusing, or that otherwise caught me off guard, it almost never made me feel dumb, a rather frequent occurrence looking back on the first game. I thought that was just what puzzle solving was for me, a roller coaster between the low lows of feeling like a complete and utter fool, and the high highs of feeling like an absolute and unrivaled genius. Turns out that if a puzzle solving experience just flows well and clicks just right for me, these lows pretty much don't exist, which is really fun. So yeah, I always felt like I could solve any puzzle the game presented as long as I approached it in the right way, the vast majority of the time. The few exceptions were either types of puzzles that I just don't like, literally one poorly designed puzzle in the main game, or in side content that isn't part of the main story and mystery, which I'll go into more detail on much later in the video. So yeah, part of this isn't at all the game's fault. I'm just still terrible at certain types of puzzle solving. Theoretical spatial reasoning still absolutely feels torturous to think through, and I very often don't arrive at the correct solution, even after putting in what feels like the requisite amount of suffering. I'm bad at this type of thinking, and even doing it correctly doesn't feel satisfying. I do at least try to solve non-slide puzzles, and I have noticed at least some improvement in my performance on those. Perhaps I've advanced from completely hopeless garbage to incredibly incompetent in that respect. As slow as it is, I do feel proud of the progress I made on that, even if I'm still not particularly enjoying these types of puzzles. Slide puzzles, I've just completely given up on for the time being. I don't have any fun interacting with them, and I don't feel like any of the time I've spent with them in these last two games has helped me understand them any better. I either hand them off to Lily or just use a guide. Thanks for that, Lily. I'm beginning to think she might not like these types of puzzles either. If there are any types of puzzles or thinking that you don't like engaging with, it is fairly likely that at some point you'll encounter them in some capacity in this game, so consider yourself warned. I'd highly recommend regularly turning to online resources to sort of negate any part of this game that you don't like if you're at all comfortable doing that kind of thing. Specifically, the best resource I've found for any degree of help with this or any other Layton game are the guides created by Catrielle. Her guide for this game is linked in the description. Just like her guide for the first game, it's incredibly high quality, easy to navigate, and it avoids spoiling anything that you don't want spoiled by the way that it's laid out. I said it in my previous video, but it's worth repeating. She makes some of the best, if not the best guides I've ever seen. Her work markedly improved my experience with the game. I can't praise her work nor thank her enough. Anytime I reference a guide in this video, I'm referencing hers. It's fucking amazing. The one puzzle in the main game that I thought was poorly designed does kind of have to do with theoretical spatial reasoning, but my problem was with the phrasing of the puzzle, not the actual spatial reasoning bit. Basically, you're supposed to divide a circular plaza into, quote, 2 identically shaped parts using only one line. The trick is that there's a statue in the middle of the plaza, so trying to divide it by going through the middle would actually create 2 lines. This one genuinely stumped me for a while because I couldn't think of a way to get 2 identical shapes without going through the middle. It's not quite as bad as any of the puzzles that I really disliked from the first game. The second hint clearly explains what the trick to getting the answer is. Just because something is an identical shape doesn't mean it has to be an identical size, which might be technically true. I'm not educated enough on this subject to tell, but I really think the word identical takes this puzzle from clever wordplay into intentionally misleading. I'd argue that changing the size of a shape means it's a different shape, so it's not actually identical, but whatever. Of all the philosophical hills I could die on, this is definitely not the one that's gonna get me. It was the only puzzle in the whole game that made me feel like it was just trying to trick me solely for the sake of tricking me. It felt mean and I didn't like it. It sucks, but it's such a minuscule chunk of the overall experience that it's only noteworthy in how different it is from the rest of the very well-designed puzzles that I don't want to spoil the solutions to, so, you know. The increase in production quality also affects the presentation of the puzzles. The art presented in the puzzles is just as great as the art in the first game, but it's much more frequently occurring, especially on the victory screens. I do still really love almost all of this art. It's super cute, and there's a new twist that I think is really neat. The NPCs who appear in the puzzle art are actually now recurring characters who appear in a variety of different puzzles. I guess they're kind of like actors playing the roles of people related to or in the puzzle that you're solving, which takes it from super cute to super duper cute. Non sequitur story time. When I was a very little girl, I actually really loved math. It was my first exposure to logic that I could understand, replicate, and apply to the world around me. It just made sense to me, both in how it worked and why it mattered. I saw it when my mom bought things at the grocery store. I calculated how close I was to catching them all in Pokemon. I saw life points ticking down in Yu-Gi-Oh! It existing in my life made me much more willing to learn about it. As I got older, the math became more and more complex, and its practicality and visibility in day-to-day life became increasingly obscure. By high school, I was pretty much always asking my math teachers why or where in life we would be using the various things we were learning. More often than not, I got no answer, and by the end of my junior year, my passion for math had completely disappeared. Now, this of course ties into a number of complex real-world issues with the public school system in America, and in turn, American society at large, but all of this was to get towards the point that the context for flexing my mental muscles actually really matters to me. When that context is compelling enough, I can have fun engaging with all manner of content that, devoid of that context, I otherwise might not care about. So, for the puzzles in Layton, when I say that the implementation of and context surrounding the puzzles has gotten much better, that winds up meaning that I enjoy those puzzles a lot more. It makes me feel like what I'm doing actually matters and more firmly connects the strengths of the narrative and world building of Layton to the puzzle aspect, strengthening the entire experience. For Curious Village, I very much enjoyed the story and exploration more than the puzzles. If the puzzles weren't there, I would have probably enjoyed myself just as much. But for Diabolical Box, I wouldn't want to divorce the puzzles from the rest of the experience. I wouldn't have had as much fun with the narrative or exploration without the puzzles. That said, there are a few puzzles that are more loosely justified than others, but the vast majority actually tie into the world or characters around them in some meaningful way. I still really loved the other key component of the gameplay, that being exploration. Mechanically, it's very simple. You click a boot in the corner of the screen, which allows you to click arrows that take you to the other screens. Also, if you click on certain things in the backgrounds, Layton or Luke or Flora will comment on them, which is cute. Walking around interesting places and talking to even more interesting characters who just so happen to have puzzle-related problems or challenges to throw your way, while wonderful music plays. I fucking love it! As you can probably tell, the NPCs, music, and setting have a lot to do with how enjoyable this process is, and I already gushed about all of those quite a bit. They fit together and flow into each other very well. The exploration is what links all of the other aspects of the game together, and it does so incredibly well. So I like the puzzles, I like the characters, I like the setting, I like just walking around, I like the narrative. Actually, I really like all of those things. Maybe even love them. All of the big pieces are really fun. Now we've just got a couple of other smaller pieces to take a look at. Granny Riddleton is back and just so happens to travel to all of the locations that you're traveling to, so you can access her shack of puzzles. She functions identically. Any puzzles that you miss because you progress too far into the narrative will mysteriously appear in her hut. This is important because there are a few progression blocking NPCs in the game that require you to complete a certain number of puzzles before advancing. Wonder of wonders, the puzzle game wants you to actually play puzzles. There are a lot of optional puzzles. That's a lot of content that you could just skip. And you don't actually have to solve all of the puzzles if you don't want to, you can pick and choose. And Granny R existing means you can choose from any of the puzzles that you missed for this as well. I was doing literally every puzzle as soon as it became available, but it's still a good feature. The problem I have with her is the same as in the first game. Interacting with the puzzles through her shack doesn't give you the pre and post puzzle dialogue that you would get from NPCs. I like that dialogue a lot, so I didn't want to miss any of it, which of course meant that I used that oh so wonderful guide. Oh, also, the puzzle index returns, which allows you to replay any puzzle that you already solved. Not something I particularly care for, but it's nice that it's there. This next thing is tied both into the puzzles and the exploration. Hint coins return, and are somewhat improved in their implementation. Broadly speaking, they're the same. You click around on the background until you find a hint coin, and those coins can be spent in puzzles to unlock a hint. Each puzzle has 3 hints, and each of those hints is increasingly more direct than the last. I did not use any of the hint coins because collecting them changes a thing on the pause screen, and that was enough to turn on the crazy completionist compulsions. That lovely guide can provide those hints without spoiling the answers if you want the hints but still want to save the coins in game. The visuals of the background do kind of indicate where hint coins could be sometimes, but the backgrounds are so visually busy that there are very often a lot of places that hint coins could be. If I weren't just using that guide for these as well, it would have meant randomly clicking around the screen. I learned my lesson in the first game, not gonna bother with that process again. Oh, and side note, puzzle charms were completely removed. I didn't think they really added much to the first re-release, so I'm completely fine with their absence. If you're not interested in finding all of the hint coins, there are some things that will assist with finding a few of them. There's a change that I like a lot. Screens will never get additional hint coins added to them. They each have a set amount, so you don't have to click around randomly even more as you progress in the plot. There are also some side activities that can assist in finding specific coins in a few ways, which is appreciated, but I still don't really like the system overall. So, the Friender construction, furniture organizing, and painting puzzle are gone. They were contextualized in the original adventure. It wouldn't really make sense for those same exact side activities to return. They're replaced by a couple of other long-term side objectives that still provide a change of pace from the regular rhythm of the game. Most of them involve items that you get for solving puzzles. They're long-term goals to pick away at as you progress through the game, and completing them unlocks some bonus content. Same general idea, but they're very different in their specifics. So, the first one you unlock is the hamster workout minigame. Okay, basically, The chef on the Military Express has a pet hamster who he asks Layton and Luke to look after and help to get in shape. The items you collect for this are toys and snacks that the hamster likes. All of these have different properties. Hamtaro here will interact with them differently. You're supposed to lay the items out on a grid in such a way that he takes the highest number of possible steps in one go. Once he's taken the requisite amount of steps, he reaches the next fitness tier and loses a bit of weight. It is a cute, fun puzzle, but you get way more items than you need to actually solve it. I kind of wish there were like bonus tiers for going extra steps so you were incentivized to continue playing around with it after the initial goal is met. We could have him looking like a JoJo hamster after a few extra tiers. After you finish the minigame, he'll point towards hint coins in the environment, just like Friender did. Hot take! I like Friender more than Hamtaro. Shocking, I know. This whole subplot struck me as a bit fatphobic, like conceptually. The dialogue didn't strike me as particularly mean-spirited, but the titles of his fitness tiers definitely did. There are definitely other chubby characters that aren't mocked for their weight. It's kind of a one-off thing, but I did not care for that particular element. Also, the hamster can talk? I think this is meant to be what Luke hears when he talks to animals, which again is just them having entire conversations, which brings up questions of the sentience and sapience of animals, which naturally leads into a series of moral questions that I don't think this series is going to address. This is Layton, not Magnus, but it's still kind of fucked up to think about on anything but the most surface of levels. It's a bit weird that this is the only animal we get to see speak, though. I'd expect to actually be able to see the other instances of Luke talking to animals, but we don't. Overall, a pretty lackluster addition, but a fun puzzle. The second of these, I like a lot more. There's a tea brewing minigame. You collect ingredients, then use the ingredients to brew tea for various NPCs. The NPCs will give you hints to indicate what types of ingredients you should use. Upon initially brewing a new type of tea, Layton and Luke will comment on it. They will also comment upon failed experimental teas. All of this dialogue is top quality, and I cannot think of anything more in character than for Layton and Luke to be brewing, tasting, and commenting on various types of teas. Upon serving the tea to the NPC, they'll comment on it as well, and then in most cases go on to tell you a new piece of information related to the mystery, setting, or other characters. It's simple, but it gives me a lot more of that sweet, sweet dialogue, and helps to characterize both Layton and Luke in a cute, fun way. It's my favorite side activity in this one, but it does have a problem, and it is a pretty significant issue. Tea can only be served to NPCs who are in distress, which is indicated by like cartoony sweat drops above their head. The problem is that when these sweat drops will appear is entirely random. So if you want to serve tea to all of the NPCs, you have to walk in and out of whatever screen the NPC is on repeatedly until it happens to trigger. And there is nothing in game that indicates which NPCs have the possibility for this to happen. So if you don't use a guide, you would have to do it on every single screen with an NPC until you would happen to complete all of them, which sounds absolutely fucking miserable. Aside from that very awful problem, I like it. Then there's the camera, which has an interesting form of progression. At first, you're collecting pieces of a broken camera and assembling them. It's sort of like a more interesting version of the portrait minigame's gameplay and the Robo-Puppy's theme from the first game, but after you finish assembling the camera, the side objective changes significantly. At that point, making progress on the side objective has to do with going to specific locations. Basically, once you have the camera, when entering certain locations, you can take a picture. That picture will have differences from the actual map. Each picture taken unlocks a puzzle of sorts. These don't count towards completed puzzles or go in the index, they're their own kind of thing. As you may have guessed, in these puzzles, you spot the difference between reality and the picture. Each of these puzzles has 3 differences, and each of these differences correlates to the location of 2 hint coins and 1 hidden puzzle. This is how hidden puzzles return, and while they still don't make much in-universe sense, it is actually fun to do something to find them rather than having to click around randomly on the environment. The only problem I have with these is that some of these differences are very, very minor. The backgrounds have a lot of detail. Most people probably aren't going to notice a different number of like small garlic cloves hanging from a ceiling without poring over every detail of the picture. When I stopped having fun with any one of these, I just used that incredibly useful and versatile guide to give me the answer, because it's my experience and I get to define it, damn it. Finally, there's the most needlessly complexly constructed diary I've encountered in any fictional work, or reality for that matter. At some point in the story, you find a diary on the ground. It has multiple locks on it. Each lock corresponds to an entry. You collect keys by solving puzzles. Those keys allow you to unlock each entry and learn some stuff related to the plot. Yes, that was incredibly vague. But wouldn't you know it, the secret details in the diary that requires a ludicrous number of keys to entirely unlock has spoilers in it. Crazy. Actually, I can't decide if it's the most securely locked thing ever, it takes more keys to unlock than the fucking nuclear football, or the loosest guarded secret ever, because you actually unlock all of the locks with completely random keys, not specific ones. It's very well written stuff. I definitely felt rewarded for tracking down all of those completely random keys. Just whoever actually made that diary is the dumbest genius ever. Overall, these side objectives are a strange comparison to the first game. I think the puzzly aspects of them are more fun to engage with, but they also have more noticeable problems. I definitely appreciate that these aren't just rehashes of what the first game had to offer, and overall I think I like them more. They actually provided interesting gameplay, but ask me that again while I was just sitting there entering and exiting a screen over and over again to proc the worry sweats that can only be cured by the correct cup of tea, and I wouldn't have sounded particularly happy about the changes. Hopefully, the next iteration of these side objectives can iron out the issues while continuing to provide a fun distraction from the usual flow of the game. There's also a bonus menu that contains quite a bit of content. This is another thing that should be very familiar to you from the first game. You select it from the main menu, then load your save based on how many pick rats you've collected, how much progress you've made, and how many of those side activities you've finished. You unlock new things to do here. There are weekly puzzles that originally released every week for the first half a year or so after the game came out. They're all just there on the mobile version. DS's online is dead, which means you need to jump through hoops to unlock these there. Another reason that the mobile version is just more convenient. These clearly have less production quality put into them than the puzzles in the main game. There's less new art for them, and the first third or so of them are like pretty lackluster in design. Past that, they're fun though. Yes, I'm repeating myself from my first video, but it's all still true, so that's that on that. There's also concept art, a music player, a cutscene player, and things to that effect. My favorite of these are the profiles because you actually get to learn new information. There are even profiles for the NPCs that appear in the puzzle art, painting them as a troupe of actors, which is absolutely adorable. The challenge puzzles return, and like half of them are still very much out of my depth, but I'm sure the people who are absolute puzzle fanatics would get a lot of mileage out of them. There's also a bonus puzzle that you originally needed a code from Curious Village to access, but it's just here in the mobile version. Fair enough. But it's a slide puzzle, so ugh. It has a cute sentiment, though. So yeah, the second Layton game, Professor Layton and the Diabolical Box, or Pandora's Box, depending on your region. This game was pretty much everything that I would want a sequel to be. It walks the line nearly perfectly between improving upon the old, while also introducing new aspects. It's everything that I loved about the first game, everything I thought the first game could have been, while also surpassing what I thought Layton in general could be. Honestly, this game is so excellent that if the rest of the franchise can just maintain this level of quality, then I'll be very satisfied with my time. After every session, I constantly found myself wanting to come back for more. I just care so much about this game. I was almost constantly having an amazing time with it. I loved every single story beat and character. I was consistently having fun with the puzzles, and for any part of the game that I even slightly disliked, I just used a guide to completely negate my problems. But even without a guide, this one would still be absolutely phenomenal. I wholeheartedly recommend it, even to people who don't normally like puzzle games. Playing the first game did add to my experience. I recommend playing it before this one, but it's not required reading if you really want to skip it. Even after the first game, I didn't expect at all to love this game as much as I did. It was a very welcome surprise, and I now have very high expectations for Unwound Future and all the other games to follow. Being excited about games is fun, actually. Who knew? This has been Kalice. Thanks for watching. You can like the video, subscribe, or share this video around if you enjoyed it and want to. My Patreon exists if you'd like to support me. There's neat bonuses like access to my Discord server and the ability to listen to hours-long raw recording sessions that are kind of sort of like podcasts maybe. So feel free to go look at that if you would like to. Speaking of, big thanks to all of my current patrons like Lotta, Edith, and Sam, all of whom are really cool people. Keep loving what you love, and I'll see you next time with something else. Of course, I go and get into something by level 5, and then they shut down their North American operations, and the plans for future localizations of their games becomes entirely unclear. They haven't actually confirmed anything, but so say industry insiders. Ugh. There's enough love for Layton that one way or another, whether or not it's a real story or not, I'm sure the games will get translated at some point, but who knows how long the wait for those could be. At least I still have quite a few Layton games to go. Positive note to end on. I don't know. Trans rights. I did finger guns. That doesn't translate. Just know that I did finger guns. Am I gonna leave all of this in? Probably. Fuck it. Trans rights. I said it twice. 'Cause it's important.